My name's Dave Branscome. We're going to be talking about the tool called DeTTECT and how it works together with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework to help you get a better understanding of your logging in your environment and what you'll be able to identify as attacker behavior in your environment. So, this is me. So I do work for Microsoft. I work in what's called the Global Partner Solutions Group. I'm a security, compliance, identity, and now management lead, so it's now SCIM. Been at Microsoft for about 14 years. I live in Raleigh, and you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. Are there any Microsoft partners here? I'm sure some of you are Microsoft partners. Okay, so we work with Microsoft partners to train them on the security tools that are available. I'm going to try to make this as vendor neutral as I can, but I will tell you how some of the things work with Microsoft stuff. All right, so let's talk first about attack, the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, and probably most of you are already familiar with this to a certain extent. MITRE ATT&CK was developed by the MITRE Corporation back in 2013, and the reason behind it was they wanted to document some of the common tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques that are being used by advanced persistent threats to attack Windows and other enterprise networks. So it was really created out of a need to document a couple different things that didn't exist in other frameworks. So there are other frameworks. Lockheed's got a kill chain framework, and there's other ones that you can use. But there's something unique about MITRE ATT&CK when you compare it to those other frameworks. So, first of all, it was addressing four primary issues. Number one was identifying adversary behaviors. So, typically, some of the things that threat hunters would look for are things like common domains that attackers are using, or IP addresses, or file hashes, things like that. But the problem with that, obviously, is that that's easily changeable, right? An attacker can change domains, they can change IP addresses at the blink of an eye. They can automate it. So we wanted to look, or MITRE wanted to look and see, how do we identify the behavior rather than the specific indicator, right? Secondly, as I mentioned, there were other adversary models or life cycle models that didn't really fit into what we're trying to do. So the cyber kill chain concepts were maybe a little bit too high level, too abstract. And so the MITRE ATT&CK Framework was designed to give very specific behaviors to look for and how those behaviors were performed by an adversary. It needed to be applicable to real environments. So this is what we see in the attack framework is what we actually see in the wild. These are things that adversaries are actively using, and it becomes more real world to us rather than kind of a theoretical concept. And then the last one, which is not a trivial issue, is common text. I can't read that. Speak up? Okay. So we wanted to have a common taxonomy. So think about a scenario where you are, you're managing your enterprise environment. And in that enterprise environment, you identify that you've been breached. So you call in Mandiant, you call in Microsoft, you call in the FBI, whoever, right? They come in, and you may have two different ways of describing the same type of behavior. You may have two different ways of identifying where the attacker is in the breach. And so the MITRE ATT&CK Framework gives everybody a common taxonomy. We all know what reconnaissance is made up of. We all know what initial access is made up of. We know what persistence is made up of. And so these different groups that have to communicate about an attack can use this common framework for communicating the aspects of the attack. So ATT&CK stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. And if the way it's made up, if you've seen the ATT&CK framework, and I'll show you here in just a few minutes. Oh, I forgot to check Wi-Fi, but we'll see. So one of the things that you're trying to identify are the tactics and the techniques. And the difference between tactics and techniques is a tactic is identifying why an attacker did something. What are they trying to do when they are performing these actions? So maybe their goal is persistence in your network. Maybe their goal is exfiltration of data. That's the why part. The technique describes how they're going to accomplish that, right? So if they're trying to establish persistence, maybe they change your startup folder. Maybe they modify registry keys. That's the how of what they're trying to accomplish. So that's the tactics and techniques part of it. Just for those of you that may be curious or are going to be taking pictures, there's a link at the end of the deck where you can download the entire deck, and you're welcome to it. So in Microsoft tools, this is the sales pitch thing, right? So in the different Microsoft threat hunting tools, MITRE ATT&CK is becoming more and more prominent in how we talk about adversary behavior. So if you're using Sentinel, or if you're looking at Sentinel, in the hunting blade, you see in the red box, those are the MITRE tactics that are identifiable using different queries and so on. If you're using Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, our endpoint protection tool, it'll identify MITRE attack techniques in the specific alert. So you get an alert on one of your endpoints, you can go in and find out what tactic, what technique is being leveraged by the attacker. If you're using Microsoft Defender for Cloud, what we used to call Azure Security Center, it's available in the resource health. So it'll tell you it gives you recommendations about what needs to be changed and why. In other words, what type of adversary behavior would you be preventing by making these recommendations, or by performing these recommendations. So I said that the MITRE ATT&CK Framework is a matrix. This is what it looks like. So along the top, those are the tactics, right? And it may be a little bit hard to read, but you have initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, and so on. And then underneath those are your techniques. So how the adversary achieves that objective. And some of them you see have like a little gray box beside them. That just means that they're expandable. In other words, as an example, on the far left side here in the middle, the gray box is talking about phishing. So the sub-techniques for that might be spear phishing, and things like that. So it's giving you more specific types of behavior that an adversary might use to accomplish their goal. There are different matrices in attack for different types of environments. So it was originally designed with Windows in mind, but it has since expanded to cover mobile OSs, Linux, Mac OS, cloud platforms like Office 365, Azure AD, Google. You see here an example of Office 365, and you can see that there's obviously a difference, right, in the number of tactics, or the number of techniques available to an attacker in Office 365 versus on a Windows machine that they can do a lot more stuff on. Recently, they also released version 11 of the ICS attack framework. So for industrial control systems, they have an attack framework as well. So what else is in attack? You can use attack when you dig into it. There's different tools or capabilities within it that can help you to identify who the adversaries are, what type of behaviors they might be engaged in, and all this is going to play into later on. We want to identify, am I logging the right things for the adversaries I'm trying to defend against? Okay, so in this case, you can look up different threat groups. What I've shown here is the Cobalt group. So the Cobalt group is also identified as Gold Kingswood. They're known as the Cobalt Gang, Cobalt Spider. It's good to know when these groups are linked together or that they have similar tactics, because then your coverage for your logging can cover the attack techniques for a variety of different attackers. It also sometimes will give you attribution, so what country is involved, or if it's just a cyber criminal gang. That's kind of a hard one, right? Attribution is not always the easiest thing to provide, but sometimes they're pretty certain that it's an Iranian actor or Russian or Chinese actor, and they'll call that out. But the thing that's important here is that they'll also identify who typical targets have been. So if you're in the energy sector, if you're a government agency, if you're a nonprofit, sometimes they'll call out those industries as being particularly targeted by those groups. And that can help you to frame and shape the way that you do your logging in your environment if you know that these are the types of attacks that are being performed against your type of industry. Somebody have a question? Thought I heard somebody. Okay. Incidentally, if you ask a really good question, I got prizes. All the hands go up. No. All right, so let's take a quick look at the attack framework. And hopefully I don't have a browser. Let me fix this real quick. What's the wireless here? I'm sorry, I meant to ask. Relics Variety Guest, that works.
Yeah, you can connect later.
I don't need to do anything super intensive, just make sure that this works. Okay, so this is the attack framework. Try to make this a little bit bigger for you. So as you can see, in this case, if we want to take a look, for example, at persistence. Persistence is a pretty common one to take a look at. So it gives you ideas about the way that an attacker will achieve persistence. So maybe they'll manipulate an account. They'll escalate privileges from one account to another, or they'll move from one account to another. Maybe they'll change a login script or an initialization script. They might create or modify a system process. And now, if we click on the gray bar here, it tells us some of the things that fall under that system process capability. So some of this is Linux-based, some of it's Windows-based, right? And if we, you can also look in each of these individual, oh great. I thought that was working. I apologize, folks.
To RX1. This is the password.
Oh, I spelled it wrong. All right. Don't worry about it. What you can do, I'll get this set up right here in a second. There we go. Okay. So if we look at the, whoops. Up here along the top. So remember I was talking about the groups, so you can look at groups here. And you can find the different adversary groups listed here. So if we want to look at backdoor diplomacy, for example. So here it tells us that backdoor diplomacy has targeted ministries of foreign affairs, telecom companies in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Tells us some of the techniques that are commonly used by backdoor diplomacy. Some of the software that they're known to use, Mimikatz and Quasar Rat and so on. Right? So we can go ahead and look at those. And then if we go to different tactics, then the tactics tell us how they accomplish these things, right? So how they perform this, what the mitigations are, and how you detect these things. All these pieces come into play with DeTTECT. So DeTTECT, again, is designed to show you where you have gaps in your logging that would help you to identify attackers, okay? So let's pop back into the deck here, and all right. So just an example, the techniques and sub-techniques. Here again, you have the phishing example with spear phishing attachment, spear phishing link, spear phishing via service. It tells you the sub-techniques, but it also tells you which platforms may be vulnerable to this type of an attack. So in this case, Google Workspace, Linux, Office 365, kind of everything. Then the procedure examples and the mitigations, as we were talking about, shows you how an attacker performs this type of an attack, what software they may have been using to perform this attack, and then again the mitigations. So mitigations are kind of iffy. Sometimes they're very generic, like in this case, use antivirus, anti-malware. All right, well, probably most people are already using that, but it didn't catch it. So you might have to find some other ways of preventing this. The detections are the important part. So with detections, all this information about attackers, all the information about the techniques that they use, the tactics that they use, none of it matters if you can't see them, right? If they're just operating under an invisibility cloak, that's no good to you to know all the stuff that they might be doing, right? You want to know how they're doing it and how to identify it. So detection in the MITRE ATT&CK Framework is what we're going to key in on with the DeTTECT tool. So what is DeTTECT? So DeTTECT is an open source tool, and it's designed to help you understand the quality, the visibility, the coverage, and help you to identify specific threat actor behaviors. It's made up of a Python tool, some YAML administration files, the DeTTECT editor is just a web browser interface, and then what we call scoring tables. So in this deck, I have step-by-step exactly how to set this up. I set this up on a brand new machine last night on this laptop, starting from building my Hyper-V VM. It was a Windows 10 VM. To the time that it was functional was about an hour and 15 minutes. So and most of that was installing the OS, right? So it's not complicated. And if you follow this step by step, it will work. I've done it several times just to confirm that I haven't missed any steps or overlooked anything. So what it gives you in the end is something like this. It gives you a heat map of where your logging is good and where your logging needs to be shored up to detect certain types of behaviors, right? So where you see the color coding is white, that means you have no logging visibility for that specific technique. Where it's dark purple, in this case, where it's dark purple, it tells you that you've got good logging, you're very likely to identify this type of technique. It doesn't write queries or anything for you, it's just telling you you've got good enough logging that you should be able to identify this type of thing if you're looking for it, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so you might say, wait a minute, I have looked in Sentinel, isn't there something like that in Sentinel? And the answer is kind of. So there is a form of a heat map in Sentinel that does this, but what it's looking at is, do you have a rule, an analytic rule that looks for this type of behavior? It's not telling you whether the logging that you're ingesting is good. It's telling you, do I have a rule that looks for this? Okay? So this is valuable up to a point, but what if you want to go to your boss and you're trying to make a case for, you have to buy more storage, you have to buy a different tool for logging, what if scenarios. DeTTECT is much better at providing you that sort of information that will allow you to make your case, right? So, yeah, Sentinel has some stuff, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not quite as good as DeTTECT. And you didn't hear that from me, and it should be edited out. All right, so installing DeTTECT on Windows. This is the step-by-step stuff. I know you're not going to be able to read it. Some of it's a little bit small on the slide. Again, download the slides. There's a link at the end of the deck. and I promise you it'll work. So again, I start off with a brand new Windows 10 VM on my laptop. You install the Windows subsystem for Linux. That'll give you an Ubuntu environment on your Windows VM. So the way you install it is this WSL --install -d Ubuntu. You restart your machine. One thing you have to keep in mind, if you're doing this on a VM, as I was, you may have to configure what we call nested virtualization. So essentially what you're trying to do is on your VM, you've got a virtual machine and you're creating another virtual machine inside it. Okay, that's the nested part. So you have to configure the extensions using the PowerShell commandlet there. That will allow you to configure, or that'll allow you to run this virtual environment for Ubuntu inside your virtual environment for Windows. Make sense? Okay. Once you log in again, the Ubuntu environment will come back up. It'll ask you for a username and password. If you've only worked in Windows, make sure you remember Linux does not like capital letters, right? So you have to use lowercase letters. You know, you can use whatever name you need. It doesn't have to relate in any way to the Windows machine that it's running on, right? It can be John, it can be DeTTECT, whatever, but set up the username and password. Good practice is to update your distro. So use sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade. That'll get your distribution up to, or your distro up to the latest and greatest. Then what you do is you go in, so DeTTECT is stored up on GitHub. So you need to clone the GitHub repository down to that Ubuntu distro. And that's the command to do it. It's a pretty simple thing. That's the entirety of what it shows you on your screen. And then you've got the files from the GitHub repository in the Ubuntu distro. From there, you're going to cd into the DeTTECT directory, and you're going to install the Python environment. And the steps for installing that Python environment are there. The last thing that you might want to do is run this last command, python detect.py, and that'll just give you the syntax for the DeTTECT script, right? So it's not going to do anything amazing when you do that. It's just going to give you syntax. But that'll tell you that everything's installed correctly and ready to go. Again, this part probably took 15 minutes, right? It's not that complicated. So once it's installed, you can start using the DeTTECT script to do DeTTECT-y things, right? So one of the easy things to do is run this python detect.py generic-ds, and that'll give you information about data sources. So what data sources are interesting in your environment, or where do you get the most visibility? So as you look at this, and again, it might be hard to read from back in the back, but like the top listed data source is command execution. And it says that it shows up 255 times in DeTTECT. So one thing that you don't want to do is make the mistake of believing that anything that's low on this list, or that has fewer instances of the list on the list, that it's not important, right? That's not the case. Just because something only has a few instances may only mean that there's only a few ways to do something, but it could be something that's very bad. So don't view this as a ranking. It's just giving you an idea of how many times this data source shows up in the attack framework. It's also important to know the kinds of data that you can get from each platform or service. So, for example, DHCP, right? DHCP logs are often very valuable. You're not going to get DHCP logs from Office 365, right? You're not going to get DHCP logs from Google Workspace. You will get it from your on-prem Windows environment. So this table is kind of useful in just understanding where you can expect to get certain types of logs within your environment. Okay, so what does this thing do? How do you use it, right? So you've got it installed, you've got the environment set up, it's ready to go. What do you do with it? So the first thing is you open the DeTTECT editor. The DeTTECT editor is a web page. It's just a very simple web page, and on that web page you're going to create a YAML file. The YAML file is going to be comprised of your opinion, and I emphasize this is your opinion, of the quality of your logging. Okay? I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But remember, this is not doing an automated evaluation of your logging. It's asking you, how well do you think you're doing in this? How well are you doing as far as retention? And then from there, it applies that against the MITRE ATT&CK Framework and gives you some information. So once you create this YAML file, you save it, and then you need to convert the YAML file from YAML format into JSON format. So ATT&CK Navigator uses JSON. So there's a one-line script that you use to convert the YAML into JSON format. Then you upload that JSON file into ATT&CK Navigator so you can get the visualization. So to run the editor, it's just that Python DeTTECT.py editor. It brings up this web page, as you see here. So as you see in the lighter blue, you've got data sources, techniques, and groups. There's different ways that you can evaluate your logging. I'm going to show you how to do it with data sources. When you open the data sources page, initially you're going to say new file. When you say new file, you identify what are the logging sources that you're going to be evaluating. Am I going to be looking at my Windows environment? Am I going to be looking at Linux? Am I going to be looking at Azure AD? Am I going to be looking at everything? Okay, so that's the data sources that you see listed in green down there. And then you give it a unique name. So in this case, it's just Contoso logging. So the way that the YAML file is constructed is this. You'll add a data source over here on the side, and you can either add all the data sources, just automatically run through all of them, or you can add individual techniques and data source things that are interesting to you. So maybe you want to look at registry key behavior. So are they creating registry keys? Are they modifying them? Are they deleting them? You can look at those very specific behaviors, or you can say, just give me everything. The next thing you're going to do is say, for that type of data source, how good is my logging? Okay? So down here, you're going to say when the logging source was connected, and then when it was enabled, is it available for data analytics? But this is the part that makes up the bulk of what you're going to do. You're going to evaluate the data source according to the completeness of the logging, the timeliness, the retention, the quality of the log. So you kind of have to know about your environment in order to fill this out, right? So if you know you're not logging, your IIS servers, right? If you know you're not capturing any of that log and dumping it into your SIM, then you'd put the slider far down, right? You don't have good logging in that. On the other hand, if you're capturing all the logs from your domain controllers, then maybe you'd bump the slider up further to the right. And you'll go through all the different data sources and evaluate those, 5 characteristics of the data. Next, you're going to save the YAML file, which is just this little button down here, Save YAML File. And then the next step is you want to convert that YAML file into JSON format. To convert it into JSON format, again, because you're using the DeTTECT tool, and the DeTTECT tool had started the editor, the web page, you need to stop that. So you do Control-C to stop the editor so that you can kind of shift gears and run the script that does the conversion of the YAML file into JSON. And that's the command that you run. And what it's going to do is it's going to take that JSON file and it's going to put it in a directory on your Ubuntu system. Okay? So now you've got this file that you need on Ubuntu, and you need to get it out of that system into Windows so that you can do stuff with it. So the way that you do that is, as you see here, if you go to this whack WSL $sign in File Explorer, That is Windows Subsystem for Linux. And that allows you to browse directly into that Ubuntu subsystem. And from there, you browse to the directory where that file has been stored and just copy it right over to your Windows system, and then you can upload it into Attack Navigator. Make sense? And if you want to run the editor again, the web page, you just run that same command, python detect.py editor. Okay, so now you've got this JSON file. It's in your Windows system, or if you're using Mac, whatever, it doesn't really matter. You go to the Attack Navigator page, and as you see here, you're going to go to upload from local, and then you find that JSON file that you copied out of your Ubuntu system. You upload it into Attack Navigator, and you get this. Okay? So now it's telling you these are the data sources that you're logging for, or based on the data sources that you're logging for, these are the different techniques that you can identify, and it can kind of give you an idea of the likelihood that you'll identify these techniques based on the heat of the color, right? So that's not the only thing you can do, however. So you can export the data to Excel. So for example, if you want to store this data and have kind of a running history of how well you've improved the data sources or the logging in your environment, you can run this DeTTECT tool periodically and identify areas where you've improved your logging, and it can kind of just be an improvement catalog. You can also be very specific about the things that you're looking for with DeTTECT. So one of the things is identifying your logging coverage against all major threat groups. So based on the logging that I have right now, how am I doing against the major threat groups that are identified in attack, right? And so it'll give you a sense of whether or not your logging is good to detect that type of behavior. If you're interested in specific threat groups, so in this case, we care about Fin7 and the Cobalt group. So maybe those are attack groups that you know are targeting your industry. Maybe you're in the financial industry and you know that those are people that you're trying to defend against. So maybe you want to say, okay, based on the way that they act, show me how my logging compares to their tactics, right? And it'll give you a comparison. And as you see here, it tells you which threat groups you're comparing against. You can also get a very comprehensive coverage. So where is your visibility and where is your coverage? Or where, maybe both, right? So let's take a quick look, and hopefully my VM didn't crash in the meantime, but I'll show you what this kind of looks like. Okay. So this is the DeTTECT editor. I go into data sources. Well, I'll start at home there. So I go into data sources. In this case, I'll say new. I'm going to name it. I'll call it B-Sides Knox. Here's where I identify the platforms that I'm interested in. So I'll say Windows. And I'll say add data source. Add applicable. I'll say the date it registered was January 1st. Date it was connected was January 2nd. Yes, yes. And then down here is where I'm identifying the data quality, right? So what I'm looking at here is I'm identifying this for all the data sources that are possible. So I can say, maybe my data field completeness. So data field completeness, think about this. Just because you're logging something in Windows doesn't mean you're logging everything you can for that specific event, right? So command line execution, you may be able to capture that with sysmon, but it's not captured by default in Windows. So you might say, I'm not capturing all the data I should for this type of event, and and so I need to improve that. So we'll say it's good. Consistency, I'm getting it for about 50% of the machines. Timeliness, pretty good. We get the logs every day. And retention, we're storing it pretty well. Okay? So now, I go back here, and hopefully this will work right. So save the YAML file. Now what's happened is the YAML file has been saved. Here's my DeTTECT editor. You see I ran the command once before, but we'll run it again. Okay, so it gave me this output of a JSON file. So all I did was convert the YAML file into JSON. Now I have this JSON file that I need to get over into Windows so that I can work with it. So I go whack whack WSL, $. It prompts me Ubuntu is the share. Then I go to Home, DeTTECT, DeTTECT, Output, and bsides2 is the JSON file. I just copy it over to my C drive. Now I go over to the attack navigator. Let's kill this. Do open existing layer, upload from local. And maybe I did this right, maybe I did it wrong, I'm not sure, we'll see. Okay, so it only gives me a couple things that I'm identifying in this case. So I can find past the hash, past the ticket type of attacks, it's clear I've got some work to do in my logging, right? That's the key. But it's giving you an idea of where you can start with identifying the logs that are necessary. So again, this is very, very easy to set up. I set it up on a VM. I could just as easily have set it up on my machine, but I don't want to mess it up, and Microsoft would probably scream if they saw me installing Linux. Okay. So to kind of wrap things up, what does DeTTECT allow you to do? It lets you score the quality of your data sources. You get insight on the detection visibility that you have. You can map your detection coverage, map your coverage versus a threat actor's behaviors, and it can identify areas for improvement in your logging so that you can increase your chances of threat detection. So there's some good resources here. This guy, Roberto Rodriguez, his Twitter is Cyber War Dog. He actually works for Microsoft now. He's in the Mystic Threat Hunters team. He's got some really, really good MITRE ATT&CK Framework models that he's created. So he's pretty interesting to follow. And then if you want the deck, that's where it is right now. So aka.ms bsides Knox. Question?
So I have two questions. First is when you kind of get those data points on where you're lacking in detection, is there any way or like any possible addition into like identifying what is the most important for an organization to focus on now, or is that just like a business decision?
You mean like prioritizing which things you should tackle first? The question was, once you identify the gaps in your logging, how do you prioritize where you should start? And really that's a little bit of a tricky question. I would first start with saying, what are the things you most want to protect, right? And if you don't have logging for those, then clearly that's one of the first things you should do. But yeah, there is going to be some art and science to that kind of combined. By the way, here's your prize. There are some articles that you can find on Microsoft.com about things that you absolutely should be logging, at a bare minimum. I don't have a link to them on this, but those are things I would start with, and then kind of branch out from there. What are the most important, but also what are the most prevalent machines? Do you have one Linux machine or do you have 10,000, right? So kind of figure out which ones expose you the most. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Are there any other offensive-based frameworks, or are there any other offensive-based frameworks or standard guidelines that are on the radar other than
mean, so the question is, are there any other offensive frameworks that are on our radar? Honestly, I don't have anything specifically. This is one that we're focusing on with Microsoft just because it's kind of industry standard and is well known. So that's where we're putting a lot of our attention. Let's go here.
This looks useful, but it's also highly subjective.
I'm having real trouble hearing. I'm sorry.
This looks really useful, but it's also highly subjective. If you basically gave this assessment to different people on your team, guaranteed you'd get different results.
Sure.
Said, this was good, and somebody else said, actually, no, it's not. So how do you standardize it? And how do you remove humans entirely? How do you just automate? So I think using something
How do you keep people from lying, basically, is the question.
something like Splunk's common information model, maybe you can move toward automating something like this. Because it's valuable right now, but it's too subjective.
I'll agree with you. So the statement is, how good can, or how valuable can this be if it's based on your opinion? And the answer is, absolutely, that's correct, right? So you have to be very clinical in the way that you evaluate your logs, right? This isn't something that you necessarily have to show your boss, right? This is kind of an evaluation of your own environment, and you want your environment to be good. So, lying about it doesn't help anybody. That's not a good answer, I understand, but yeah, maybe using some kind of a common information model to say, these are things that must be logged. That might be one way to do it, but it's kind of informational more than a real tool that you would use to prove something in your environment. I get what you're saying, but I don't have a good answer. Ready? Any other questions? I'm out of toys. Yes, ma'am. I'm I'm sorry, I literally heard very little of that. It's very echoey.
So have you heard of CVSs?
I can't hear, I'm sorry. Come on up here so I can hear.
Have you heard of CVSs? The CVS is scoring framework where you give a score to a company or an entire house.
Oh, the CVS framework. Okay.
Because your attack framework says, if it's a script or it's a bot, if it's external Facebook where it's hosted, CVS does the same thing. It's asking how is the attack happening, what's the impact, what is the result of it. It counts and it calculates the score out there. A lot of organizations actually determine if their hiring is very vulnerable, it's high risk of how also it's came out as well.
Gotcha.
Is this specific just network-related attacks, or is this attack framework might not attack framework for everything in general? CVS is overwhelmed. It's useful.
Again, I didn't catch everything that you were saying there, but you're talking about the CVS framework and asking for a comparison. So I honestly can't truthfully say I've done a comparison between them, so I don't know that I could give you a good answer. I think the one of the advantages that I see in this, and maybe CVS has the same advantage. This is open source. It's free, right? You can download it and do it just on a VM. It doesn't take much time to get up and running. Is CVS free as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's say you have a component, Apache framework, Spring framework, anything. If there's one already found in there, it's mapped to the same framework, and the score is generated.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's critical vulnerability
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for any tool that will help you identify weaknesses, vulnerabilities. I'm not like I don't sell this, right? it's just a thing. So yeah, I mean, whatever works and gives you the information that you need, use it. Anything else? Yes, sir.
So just to be clear, this is to analyze your logs on your opinion. It's not analyzing any logs on the system.
Correct.
Okay.
It's just based on what you think your logging is. I mean, some of it is verifiable, like your retention. You know, you can say I'm retaining these logs or I'm not, right? So that's a pretty clear cut one. But timeliness, you know, what's timely?
And then I think I saw the repo. This is available as a Docker image.
So, yeah, if you go to the repo, it'll give you the instructions for how to set this up in Docker. It's much harder to set it up in Docker than it is here. So if you're not familiar with Docker or you just want to get this set up in 15 minutes, use this. So that's just my opinion for what it's worth. Anything else? Oh, yeah.
So what's the advantage of using this versus like if you have a SIEM tool that's got a plugin that does binary coverage?
Yeah, so the question is, what's the difference between using this and using a SIEM that has a MITRE ATT&CK plugin? If you have something like that, that's great. One thing, again, what I would ask is, can you do what-if scenarios with that plugin? Will allow you to model improvements in your logging to kind of make a budget case with your boss or whatever.
When you fed the config file from Navigator and you had the heat map, you were able to hover over it and it showed some information. Does it break down based off of like source by source, kind of where you're lacking and how it generated what it's...
Yeah, so let's take a look. So the question was, when you see the heat map, does it, what is some of the information it gives you there? So let's take a look at this use alternate authentication. So you see what, and I know it's really hard to read. Let's see if we can make it a little bit bigger. Let's go with phishing. We can't. So if we go with pass the hash, for example, it tells you where this type of behavior is identified in your data sources, right? So you're going to be looking for credential request, user account authentication, request logon session creation, and then in this particular case, it gives you an example of like what your coverage level is. I'm sorry, I forgot the question actually.
No, you answered. Yeah.
Okay.
I couldn't make out what was in that toolkit, so I was curious about that.
Okay. Anything else? Hope this was useful. It's a cool tool. It's free. Might as well use it. All right.